is the editor of the year's Best Sports Writing 2024, which will be available when you listen to this podcast. We have the pleasure in welcoming Jane McManus onto Hoopsology. Welcome, Jane.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me, really.
So thank you for coming on to the show. Really appreciate it. A big fan of your work, a big fan of just all your appearances on ESPN as well. So it's a pleasure for you just to spend some time with us. Before we hop into the book, we have a tradition on our podcast because we talk about the latest headlines when it concerns the world of basketball, but we delve into basketball culture. What makes the game so great? So we want to ask you, take the question any way you want. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
Yeah, I would have to say playing on West 4th Street. I was a huge pickup player back in my youth, and oftentimes I was the only woman on the court, and there was one day when went down to West 4th Street with a group of college friends, and they were all exhausted, and so they kind of hit the bricks. And then I was standing there with Next, and the actual players who play on West 4th Street showed up, and I was like, "Oh, I've got Next," and they said, "Okay, okay." Anyway, I talked four of them into playing on my team. We won the game. There was nearly a murder. It was a lot of fun. Definitely the highlight of my basketball career. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, the reason I'm a sports writer, the reason I went into sports writing was because I loved basketball. I loved playing. And, I'm 53. So I was born the year before Title IX and just didn't have the same opportunities to play that I see women having now. And it's so awesome to see how much things have changed.
No, totally agree. I want to delve into the book first, and then we can talk about kind of the state of women's sports and the WNBA, college basketball. So, with this book, I think it's very unique compared to other books out there. It's a compilation of the best sports writing from the premier sports writers in the field currently. Can you discuss the decision making process and picking which stories are the best? My assumption is that this had to be an extremely tough decision in narrowing down just which pieces are going to make it into the book. So, what was that process like, and what did you learn just in compiling kind of this best sports writing for this venture?
You're exactly right. It's a real responsibility. And because there's a lot of history with this volume, every year there are writers who they're hoping that their work is in it. They're hoping that they're writing a piece that, would be worthy of consideration. It's a responsibility to put together this volume and make sure that you've actually tried to read and encounter every story that could possibly go in it. And also just being really worried that I was leaving someone out. Obviously, Richard Deitch was the guest editor last year, and I was on his advisory committee, so I kind of got to see firsthand the nerves that go into it. The responsibility of it, and also the work. You're reading an incredible volume of work, and it's not just the normal sports outlets, right? It's not just the Athletic, the Washington Post, and the Athletic, the Washington Post, and ESPN, which are kind of the big three, I think, in terms of the volume of putting out really high quality coverage. But it's Outside Magazine, it's GQ, it's Long Lead, like all of these kind of less well known outlets, I guess, in a sports context anyway. And then you've also kind of got some missing players who were big, like ESPN the magazine and Sports Illustrated, which just aren't doing the kind of work. They're not putting the same kind of resources into long form. I mean, ESPN obviously puts a lot of resources into coverage, but their long form is just like everyone else. We have shorter attention spans now. The market has changed. Podcasts, people like to consume their news in other ways. So, kind of the space for long form has changed. And so, I'm really trying to scour those outlets. I had a number of people who I really relied on to kind of send me links and to be able to kind of go in and read at least even if somebody who works for a tiny outlet in a tiny town, they sent me something that they really thought was worthy. I read it. I read the first 500 words to see whether or not it was going to be of a caliber for inclusion. And I just think it's really an important thing for our business. As the sports media industry changes as much as it does, it's still nice to have really great examples of incredible writing that you can look at and you can show students or you can read or you can give for Christmas or in any other way that we're sharing these kinds of pieces that we find valuable.
Jane, you mentioned the state of modern media. Where where is that right now in terms of what is being put out there, and what you see maybe by the metrics is actually being consumed.
So I teach college classes, sports media and sports related classes. And every the start of every year, the start of every semester, I go around the room and I say, tell me who you are, what you want to study, who you're, how you consume media. And so every year the answers change. And the year now the answers are basically like social media. Basically I'm reading a Twitter feed. It's on a timeline of mine, however that timeline is appearing, whether it's TikTok or Twitter, now a different name for social media, or Instagram, or any of these other ways that people are consuming YouTube, obviously, like, Apple Podcasts, wherever they're getting their stuff. But generally now it used to be that somebody would name a favorite writer and an outlet. And now, sometimes they'll be able to source what the outlet is that is putting the information onto their social media feed. But often it's just that it's the social media feed itself. It's like not even sort. It's not a per it's not even it's not it's so amorphous, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You're not even paying attention necessarily to the byline. I remember there was a year where I went around and I asked this question, and I actually included who's your favorite writer. And I would say about half of them, well, no, I'd say five of them, many of them didn't name a writer. About five of them named Stephen A. Smith, who hasn't covered sports on a daily basis since he covered the 76ers for the Philly
Mm.
Inquirer, you know, 30 years ago or whatever it is now. It's different. Like, young people are consuming it different. This year in my class, one of my students said, I really love long form. And now that's my favorite student, who's getting an A. And he may not know that until he listens to this podcast, but congratulations. No, but I think it's always in flux. Everything's in flux. Different generations claim different kinds of consumption, different types of expression. You talk about culture and how it interacts. I mean, how we're consuming media is part of culture, and we're creating communities online through different podcast communities. Reddit, whatever. If you have real communities online, and so that's different. And I think people are sorting themselves into different fan communities, and teams are engaging with those communities in different ways now. So everything has really been in flux, and it's less kind of like filtered through media. And I think there's a real good place for that. Like, I don't necessarily hate that. I think there are a lot of things that change that could make you say, kind of wring your hands, like, my professors really didn't like the idea of sports betting, and it's here now. And if you want to get upset about it, I mean, go ahead, but it's a losing battle. So I think, you kind of have to adjust to the way people are consuming things now, but it has changed, and it's not in long form. And so I think in some ways, kind of really making sure that we elevate and we lift up the best of that genre, we keep it alive.
So, what is the percentage of the audience that is following journalists overall? Because I know for myself, when we put together this podcast, I wanted to make sure that we showcase journalists that are following the teams day by day. So not just like top figures in national media, but who are the reporters that are following these teams every single day to provide us just the best insight. And I find following them on social media platforms is really fascinating. I become more interested in teams that I don't really like, the Detroit Pistons or the Pelicans, or because I'm a fan of that particular journalist. But from what I'm feeling, I feel like I'm in the minority in terms of that connection. Because when I was younger, I only got more of a lay of the land from a national concept just because of ESPN, Fox Sports. A lot of my sports consumption was due to television, and now it's through social media, and I'm able to follow all these teams rapidly just through a social media feed, and let's get bites of information, as opposed to a national network or a couple of networks shaping the narrative. So I guess my question to you is, with the social media just taking over sports journalism, where do you think like the audience is really paying attention to in terms of just the newer journalists out there? Do you think that connection's more with just the information itself, or is there any kind of a chance that the audience is still having that connection with that sports writer?
I think it's a mixed bag, like you talk about, right? Like, there's nothing like following somebody who's in the locker room on a daily basis. The quality of information is better. The time that you're going to get it is better. Also, I think those reporters do try to offer insight, context, nuance, relationships. It's a different kind of thing, and I think the value is there. I think younger the younger people who and the people who follow sports through social media are definitely following, like, you know formerly, Woj, Shams, Adam Schefter. Like, they're looking for the transactional kind of coverage, right? The breaking news, the stuff that comes out right away, that's, from the GMs, that's kind of given to these folks, and then they're able to distribute it on a wider basis. I think they are still looking at like the larger outlets, like whether it's Bleacher Report or Yahoo or ESPN or The Athletic or Washington Post. They're looking for those big headlines, like the big headlines of the day. Nadal retires, who wins game one of the WNBA finals, etc. Like they are looking for that information as well. So it's kind of, I think, a bit of a mix. And then I think they're following kind of the commentariat. There's a big emphasis now on, I don't have to tell you guys that it's about who's the loudest and who has the biggest opinion and who can be the most bombastic with it. And those conversations are great. But they kind of are like, and I'm going to use a very feminine analogy. Like you have a small bit of cream in a bowl and then you just whip it into a huge froth. It's taking small pieces of information and making a lot with them. And so I think there's a place for kind of everything along that spectrum. Very much. And I think, you can go with voices because you find them entertaining. I mean, for me, the critique of media outlets for me comes when you have so many people who are just frothing and you don't have enough people who are providing good quality information. And you're not basing you're just basing your take on the outrage or the reaction that it will provoke, as opposed to the truth of what you actually think you're talking.
A quick timeout from the interview to request a favor. If you love our interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to hear more interviews from the world of basketball, featuring journalists from SB Nation, ESPN, CBS Sports, and The Athletic. Now, back to the interview.
Jane, I wanted to ask, kind of on different lines, but sort of in the modern sports journalism realm, with the changes and more open access to sports gambling, have you seen or noticed any effects on sports journalism tied to that, or just coverage that you've seen presented?
I mean, it's hard to say really, just from what you see out there. I mean, I do think it's definitely, there's so many ways that sports gambling has changed. I mean, the other thing I'll say is that I think a lot of young college age men in particular are consuming sports now through their gaming apps and their gambling apps. I mean, I think they're getting a lot of information that way as well. And that's a huge revolution when it comes to media, because the information that those apps have, that's pretty great. I mean, they're on it. They're paying real attention to the lines and to who's doing what and who's hurt and who's traded and who might start and all of that. So in some ways, that's a pretty crystal way of getting your coverage. But at the same time, I do think it has an impact, and I think you can see that on, the headlines that don't, of players who are gambling and they're getting dinged by their leagues for that. I think in the college sports setting, we've seen some real scandals kind of erupt that haven't gotten a ton of play, because media organizations now have partnerships with gambling companies and betting apps and operators. And so that is, I can tell you from working at ESPN, nobody's going to come up to you and say, or at least when I worked there, nobody was going to come up to you and say, hey, we might anger the NFL if you wrote this story, so we'd really appreciate it if you'd put your pen down and stop reporting it. However, was there enthusiasm to do a lot of hard-hitting journalism on the NFL? I mean, unless your name is Don Van Natta or Seth Wickersham, probably not. And so again, it was kind of like, and I don't know, because it's hard to quantify. I'm not in those rooms. I don't know if there's that similar kind of reluctance to do some hard hitting coverage around sports betting and the effects of it, because you might disrupt what is a really good revenue flow in this new era.
Yeah, it does kind of strike as, if not a direct, at least bordering on a conflict of interest in some ways, when you have a money source there.
Well, it's certainly, yeah, I mean, it's definitely the difference. Like, when I came into, when I started covering sports, the idea that I would place a bet was, I mean, I would do an NCAA bracket every year, but I would do it for no money, because I felt like that would have been, especially covering college sports. Like I even had to talk to myself about whether or not it was really ethical to fill out a bracket, even for no money. I just would have that conversation. And now that seems so adorably quaint, that somebody would actually think twice about it, but no, I just think things have changed and they're different. Everybody kind of has to do a gut check with themselves, but there's real money for real journalists and commentators and hosts to make if they're partnering and then, or they're, being sponsored by. And sometimes you work for an outlet where you have to do a read on something. It's not even like you personally. So I just think it's a different set of considerations now. We haven't really seen what the big negative repercussions can possibly be on sports betting. And I just am reminded, in after PAPSA was overturned, I was living in the UK at the time, and I wrote a story for the Daily News about kind of what betting looks like in a really mature betting market, which at the time was the UK. And I remember talking to somebody who was with kind of an accountability organization, and the UK and the EU have done a really good job with that. That's pretty well institutionalized over there. And someone said to me, you guys in the US take it for granted right now that everything that happens on the field is, pure action, is the result of play, and is the result of everybody working their hardest to, you know, to effort for their goals. And and he said, and there might come a day where you question that. And when you lose that, it's a real loss. It's a real loss for sports when you question the motivation of whether or not somebody's going all out and really wants to win. It sticks with me. I don't know if we've necessarily come to a time when we see that, but we are starting to see, I think, it's particularly, again, with young men who are in a statistical category where they take more risks. When you have a betting app in your hand and on your phone, there's an intimacy there. And I think we have yet to see there is going to be a societal cost to that. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's not going to be nothing. And we're smart to acknowledge that and to plan for it.
That vein, if an event like that happens, because in terms of the negatives of sports betting, we saw the betting scandal with the NBA, there was a betting scandal with the UFC. If it
Hmm.
escalates to a large, I guess, a plethora of stars, in terms, because I think in both those situations, those were not star athletes that were participating in that. But if you're dealing with somebody high profile, do you see a lot of these sports leagues pumping the brakes on sports betting if you have just the more high profile athletes getting involved in this? And do you see that's even possible? Because in my mind, I just don't see, in terms of the risk, in terms of higher, paid athletes, just because they are getting a huge salary, huge endorsements. Like, where is the kind of ROI in terms of taking a risk like that and ruining your career and legacy? So do you see that as a possible pitfall in the future with sports betting?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it would take to put the brakes on at this point. I think we're at a moment in sports overall where there's not a real incentive to close the door on available streams of money, whether it's the PGA Tour and Saudi investment, or the WTA Tour and the ATP are also kind of opening the door to that. Whether it's name, image, and likeness, we've seen the idea of the amateur system kind of fall by the wayside. Not that I think there was a lot of to be salvaged in that necessarily, but it is a change in the architecture of the second largest American sport in college football, I would say. So I think you have a lot of everyone's looking for revenue streams and looking to consolidate them. And I don't see a lot of incentive now to close the door to those streams, no matter what the particular ethical concerns are with those streams. So I guess I'm not, some people will come on and be like, I'm an optimist. I really think everything's for the best. That's not me. I am, I sometimes talk about the dark cloud. So, but at the same time, I think, sometimes it's valuable to have somebody who's not trying to put a spin on everything.
And there's all these new platforms, and there's all these different, we have YouTube, Twitter, all the social media. But yeah, I think like no one's filled that void. So two questions for you. One, can you explain the importance of those programs for younger viewers that may not be aware? And number two, do you think is it appropriate for those venues to come back, or do you think it's of a bygone era and sports journalists should adapt? Like, I just feel that those hard hitting pieces are more needed now more than ever, just in the state of the world nowadays.
So I love your question. I feel like this is a plant, like this is such an obviously, I know how I'm answering this. I think you probably do too. Yeah, I think the value of that kind of journalism is incredibly important, and more so now than ever, because again, journalism has always been about accountability. And I think now we have a lot of, like, especially in sports, and there's such a great, there's so much fandom, and there's so much of an opportunity to participate in fandom and to hear from athletes, and that's more than it ever was before. But we do lack now, I think, that same sort of space for that kind of journalism. I'm really interested to see what Jeremy Schaap does with the new sports reporters as
Agreed.
reconstituted by ESPN. I mean, I think that's great that they're doing that. He, like, Shap knows what those standards are. He's not there to do softballs. He wants to really get into stuff. So I'm enthusiastic. Again, that's not the original reporting. That's not investigative reporting, but it is at least talking about serious issues, bringing up serious issues, giving a platform to people who are doing that kind of journalism. Yes, I am sad to see that kind of thing go, which is why whenever I see, ESPN do a piece, like the one that they did on Dan Snyder, that Seth and Don did on on Dan Snyder, that's actually, in this year's volume of the year's best sports writing. I'm extremely happy for that. The Washington Post is doing incredible work, incredible work. They still cover sports in the way that sports have been covered for my entire professional life. And The Athletic is doing very quality. Again, these are um, deeply resourced outlets that still have real journalists, real journalism, editing, et cetera. I mean, you could even ask Justin that question about editing. Where are the editors? Where are the people who are helping formulate those stories? Where are the stories with 3 bylines in the sports section now, where people take 4 months and really work on something? I mean, it's almost like if you didn't tweet yesterday, then what are you doing? Like, we have that kind of a mindset where it's much more short term. So I do think it's incredibly important. And that's why it was important to me, honestly. You talk about how do you put together a volume like this. There are a couple stories that I put in that aren't necessarily like, Ernest Hemingway level prose, but they're incredible pieces of investigative journalism. And I felt it was incredibly important in this day and age to make sure that those are elevated and seen as important, and that people read those, because I do want that tradition of investigative writing to live on and to be venerated.
Jane, with what you mentioned about, the core of journalism being accountability, and with where things are nowadays, where maybe there's just more, given what you've discussed with social media and shorter attention spans, things that I think anyone who's observing and aware is aware of going on compared to how it used to be, 10, 20 years ago. Society is accelerating, attention spans are shortening. Do you think there is some sort of mechanism or way that journalism takes more of a forefront or center stage? I guess, is there a point where there's a lack of accountability? I don't know if it's overall in society or things like that, where there's sort of like a turnaround. I'm not really saying like it'll be how it was 10 years ago or whatever, any sort of like putting things back in the box, but any sort of mechanism you could see that would kind of elevate journalism, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I mean, I think that's a good question. It probably, there has to be a demand for it. You have to be able to
Mm.
monetize it. So those are the two things in this day and age. I mean, I do see, there are people who could, put together a Substack, and I think they try to do kind of on their own because they can't necessarily get a full-time job that pays a living wage doing it. So they'll kind of do it in Substack, which is happening across journalism everywhere, but that's the disaggregation then, right, of quality outlets. You're taking those quality outlets and you're taking all the journalists, and you're kind of, you know, they go into the wind and then they land where they land, and then they try to do some journalism. And I think it's, sadly, it's kind of a weaker place, one person trying to do something on their own without an outlet behind them. It just, your calls don't get returned as quickly, all of this. So I do think there would have to be, but, I mean, is there a place for, like the Defector does a good job. I think they've come out with some good pieces, and they look to do it. So I think it's, and they kind of have a bit more of a, they have a reputation for being a little bit more, again, maybe oppositional. They're not bringing the pom poms, which again, I think there's a real place for that, and they found an audience that really appreciates that. And so kind of like being the discordant voice, going left when everybody else is going right. I think there's a real place for that. And Defectors seems to have a model that's paying those writers and that they can make a living, which is fantastic. So, but I think it takes creativity with the financial model, because you can have a great idea, and if you can't monetize it or you can't sustain it financially, then you can't. So, that's why people, I think, look to the bigger outlets, because they have a kind of financial model where they could allocate resources toward journalism, whether it's sports or not. Or, or you're looking at smaller kind of like gadfly type outlets like Defector.
Jane, final question for you. You mentioned this earlier with the rise of athlete podcasts. I guess my fear is that one day we're going to get some athletes with their post-game press conferences, and it might be tough to ask a tough question. And instead of saying no comment, they're going to be listen to my podcast without any like follow-ups or nuance to questions. I just feel like a lot of athletes are having their own platforms to speak their own message, which is good, but at the same time, that's their narrative, and they have the possibilities of lying or not fully telling the truth or embellishing. So do you see a future in which your top tier athletes, forego talking to the media because they have their own platform on their own? They don't need to be asked tough questions. They can just go on like their own platform and tell their truth and make money off of it.
Yeah. So, okay, like three thoughts spring to mind while you're saying that. Well, journalism isn't PR, right? And I think some athletes believe that journalists should be kind of like, marketing arms for them or PR arms for them.
Agreed.
And that's not the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah.
And I don't think fans really just want to be sponges for happy talk, though. I think there is a demand for those tougher questions. And then the third thing I would say is that leagues have CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, with unions. And within the context of those collective bargaining agreements are the ways that athletes are the media duties that they have. And a lot of times there's a conversation between the league and the union about what the benefit is of those players talking to journalists and the role that journalism plays in the context of sports. And I think it's becoming a harder sell right now to convince athletes that they need to have CBAs where their media responsibilities are such. Yeah, I look back to 2020, when the week before Rudy Gobert tested positive, the only thing that got the NHL, the MLB, NFL, and NBA to release a joint statement was that they were closing the locker rooms to the press. And, it wasn't that journalists were more of a vector for the coronavirus than any other living entity. No, that wasn't the case. It's that they want us out of the locker rooms. And that's emblematic of this larger idea that they don't see us as useful as they used to. So that's the coming storm. That's a conversation that has to be had. So I think, as journalists, we need to adhere to certain standards of professionalism so that they don't feel like, we're trying to buddy up to them or, behave in a way that's unethical, that everybody knows kind of what the rules are, what the expectations are, and that there is a benefit to having a strong working press involved in sports coverage for all of the reasons, Justin, that you said, and you as well, Matt. So I just think, that has to be an ongoing conversation where we have to be, firm, but also understanding that athletes are more concerned about mental health now than they used to be. There is a certain amount of intrusion into their space. So is there another way to negotiate what that space would be, which would allow for informal relationships to develop so that the coverage can continue to be as strong and as candid as it always has been. But yeah, that's another front that journalism is going to have to encounter in sports for sure.
Jane, this has been a wonderful chat. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you on social media? Again, where they can find the book and any other projects you want our audience to be aware of.
Thanks so much. That's such a great way to end. I am at Jane Sports on Twitter, Blue Sky. I was on Mastodon. I haven't really gone back there. It's like everybody else very much recently. I am the guest editor of the Year's Best Sports Writing this year, which has been amazing. And in February of 2025, I have a book called The Fast Track coming out about it's called The Fast Track, the surge in the investment in women's sports. So it's something that I've worked on for a long time, and I'm very passionate about that as well.
Fantastic. We'll be keeping our eyes out for that project as well. We cover women's sports, so we'll be on the lookout for that project. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate what you guys do, and I do enjoy the podcast.
Oh, must appreciate it. Thank you, Jane, very much.